You were hired to clean this house, not pretend you belong in my family." The words crossed the nursery like a blade of winter air, sharp enough to make every adult in the room stop breathing. Richard Whitmore stood beneath the soft ceiling lights of his son's therapy suite, his charcoal suit still damp at the shoulders from the Chicago rain, his silver watch catching the glow like a cold eye. In front of him, Naomi Brooks held a piece of blue chalk between two fingers, her black maid's uniform neat except for the faint dust of color on her sleeve. Behind her, the white wall Richard had paid specialists thousands of dollars to keep blank was covered in uneven lines, small suns, open doors, crooked stars, and one shaky word written near the floor, safe. The private therapist stared at the wall as if it were damaged. The housekeeper stood frozen beside the toy shelves. Two security guards waited at the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or disappear. And half hidden behind the long cream curtains, 7-year-old Ethan Whitmore watched without making a sound. He had not spoken in almost 2 years. Not after the car accident that took his mother. Not after the doctors, the speech coaches, the child psychologists, the expensive New York consultants with leather bags and gentle voices. Ethan lived in silence now, in a mansion louder than any city street, where every polished hallway echoed with rules. No sudden noises. No unauthorized visitors. No changes to the room. No mention of Caroline Whitmore. No drawing on the walls. Naomi knew the rules. Everyone knew the rules. She had signed them on her first morning, standing in a back office while a supervisor told her the Whitmore family valued privacy above everything. She was there to clean the East Wing, change linens, dust shelves, and leave no trace of herself behind. That was what people like her were paid to do in houses like this. Move quietly. Smile politely. Become invisible. But earlier that evening, when thunder rolled over Lake Michigan and Ethan curled against the baseboard with both hands pressed over his ears, invisible had not been enough. Naomi had found him shaking, not from cold, but from a fear. Too deep for words. She had not touched him. She had not called him broken. She had simply lowered herself to the floor 6 feet away, placed the chalk where he could see it, and drawn a small door with light coming through it. Then she wrote safe in slow letters, each stroke gentle, patient, breathing with the storm. Ethan had stopped trembling. For the first time since she entered that house, he reached for the chalk himself. Richard had not seen that part. He had only seen the wall. He looked at Naomi now, not as a woman who had helped his son breathe, but as a maid who had forgotten her place. "Pack your things," he said, voice low and final. "You're fired. Leave before sunrise." Naomi's throat tightened, but she did not beg. She looked once toward the curtain, where Ethan's small fingers clutched the fabric. His eyes were wide, silent, pleading. Naomi set the blue chalk carefully on the floor, as if leaving behind something sacred, then walked past Richard with her head held steady. No one noticed Ethan step out from behind the curtain until the door closed behind her. The service hallway outside the therapy suite smelled of lemon polish and rain-soaked wool, the kind of clean scent that made a house feel cared for without ever asking who did the caring. Naomi Brooks walked through it slowly, one hand resting near the pocket of her apron, where she kept a folded bus schedule, 2 breath mints, and a photograph of her grandmother sitting on the front steps of their apartment building in South Shore. Her cheek was warm from shame, not because anyone had touched her, but because everyone had watched. That was the part that stayed under the skin. The watching. The silence. The way people in expensive houses could make a person feel smaller without raising their voices. She passed the linen closet, the silver laundry carts, the back staircase she had climbed every morning before sunrise, and for a moment she heard Ethan again, not speaking, never speaking, but breathing in that uneven way children breathe when fear had nowhere else to go. Naomi had learned to hear things other people missed. A chair leg scraping half an inch. A child holding breath before tears. The tiny rhythm of fingers tapping cloth when words were trapped behind the mouth. Years before she ever put on a Maid uniform, she had studied special education at Malcolm X College, taking night classes after working 8 hours at a grocery store on 79th Street. She loved the quiet science of attention, the idea that language could be found in pointing, blinking, drawing, humming, turning away, or sitting close without touching. Then her grandmother's heart surgery came first. Rent came first. Medicine came first. School became a folder of old papers in a cardboard box under her bed. She did not complain about it. Complaining did not pay electric bills in February. Instead, Naomi took whatever honest work she could find, and when the agency sent her to the Whitmore estate, she accepted because the hourly rate was better than anything else within 2 train rides from home. The mansion sat behind iron gates north of the city, nearly 12,000 square feet of pale stone, glass, and silence. On her first day, a supervisor told her Mr. Whitmore did not tolerate mistakes. On her second day, a cook whispered that the boy upstairs had not spoken since his mother died. On her third day, Naomi saw Ethan standing barefoot at the top of the stairs, watching sunlight move across the floor like it was something alive. No one introduced them. No one needed to. His eyes followed her cleaning cloth as she wiped dust from the railing, and she slowed her hand just enough to let the motion become gentle. That was all. A beginning no one else noticed. Now, as she reached the staff lockers, Naomi untied her apron with careful fingers. She folded it once, then twice, because dignity could live in small things. Behind the closed door upstairs, Ethan stood beside the blue chalk she had left behind, staring at the word safe as if it were the last warm light in the house. Richard Whitmore did not go after Naomi. He stood in the therapy suite as if the floor had been poured around his shoes, staring at the colored marks on the wall while rain tapped the tall windows in thin, nervous lines. The room had been designed to remove uncertainty. Soft white walls, rounded furniture, imported sensory lamps, a weighted blanket folded with military precision at the foot of Ethan's daybed. Every object had a purpose, every sound was measured, every change approved by a specialist whose invoices arrived in thick cream envelopes. Richard believed in systems because systems had made him powerful. He had built Whitmore Properties from a struggling family company into a real estate empire that owned office towers in Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and Denver. He understood zoning boards, interest rates, construction delays, and the kind of men who smiled across conference tables while hiding knives in contracts. He knew how to win because he knew how to control the room. But his son was not a room. That truth had haunted him for 22 months, though he never allowed himself to say it. After Caroline died on a wet November highway outside Evanston, the house had become a machine built around Ethan's silence. Breakfast at 7:30. Therapy at 9. Outdoor time if the temperature stayed above 50 degrees. No television after 6. No visitors without approval. No photographs of Caroline below the 3rd floor, because the first time Ethan saw one, he sat under the grand piano for 4 hours and would not move. Richard had removed the photographs that night himself, carrying silver frames through the hallways like evidence from a trial. He told the staff it was temporary. He told the doctors it was necessary. He told himself it was mercy. In truth, he could not bear the way Ethan looked at his mother's face, as if asking why Richard had survived and she had not. The private therapist, Dr. Marlene Hayes, cleared her throat behind him. She was tall, polished, and careful with rich grief. She had been recommended by a board member's wife and charged more per hour than Naomi made in 3 days. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. The boundary violation was serious. Children with selective mutism and trauma responses need consistency. This kind of unapproved interaction can create attachment confusion. Richard nodded because the words sounded professional and gave his anger a place to stand. Attachment confusion. Boundary violation. Unapproved. Interaction. Better than admitting that when he saw Ethan calm beside Naomi, something ugly and frightened had risen inside him. Not jealousy exactly. Not hatred. Something closer to panic. A maid had reached the place his money could not enter. A stranger with chalk dust on her sleeve had done what teams of experts had failed to do. He looked toward the curtains. Ethan was no longer there. For one sharp second, Richard's chest tightened. Then he saw the small shape of his son crouched near the base of the wall, one hand hovering over the blue chalk without touching it. Ethan, Richard said, forcing his voice to soften. The boy did not turn. Dr. Hayes stepped forward. Give him space. Richard hated needing permission to approach his own child. He hated the silence more. Downstairs, somewhere behind the walls, a service door opened and closed. Naomi was leaving. Ethan's fingers curled around the chalk at last, and Richard, surrounded by everything he owned, felt the room slip quietly beyond his control. The first line Ethan drew after Naomi left was not a word. It was a door. Small, crooked, barely taller than Richard's hand, with a square window in the center and yellow lights spilling from it like a promise. Richard watched from 6 feet away, every instinct in him fighting itself. He wanted to stop the chalk from touching the wall. He wanted to preserve order, preserve treatment, preserve the clean white surface he had mistaken for progress. But Ethan's hand was steady now, steadier than it had been all week. The boy leaned close to the wall, his dark blonde hair falling over his forehead, his bare feet tucked beneath him on the pale rug. He did not look frightened. He looked busy, focused, alive in a way Richard had almost forgotten how to recognize. Dr. Hayes lifted a cautious hand. "Mr. Whitmore, I recommend we redirect him before the behavior becomes reinforced." Richard did not answer. The word behavior landed wrong. Too small. Too clinical. This was not a behavior. This was his son reaching through glass. From the doorway, Mrs. Lillian Keller, the head housekeeper, stood with her hands folded at her waist, her gray cardigan buttoned wrong at the top as if she had dressed in a hurry. She had worked for the Whitmores for 17 years, long enough to remember Caroline dancing barefoot in the kitchen and Richard laughing before grief taught him to lock his face. "Sir," she said quietly. Richard turned, irritation flashing across his eyes. "Not now, Mrs. Keller." She did not step back. That alone made the room shift. Lillian Keller was not a woman who disobeyed rules lightly. "You need to know what happened before you came upstairs." Dr. Hayes stiffened. "This is not the appropriate moment for staff commentary." Mrs. Keller looked at the therapist, then back at Richard. "With respect, it is exactly the moment." Rain pressed harder against the glass. Ethan drew a second line beside the door. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Mrs. Keller took that silence as permission. "The thunder started at 8:14. I remember because the lights flickered in the pantry." Ethan came out of his room and crouched near the north wall. He had his hands over his ears. The evening aide tried to guide him back to bed, but he pulled away and kept looking at the window. "I called Dr. Hayes' office line. No answer. I called your assistant. She said you were in a meeting and could not be disturbed." Richard looked down. He remembered the meeting. A financing call for a luxury tower in Miami. He had muted his phone when the house number appeared because interruptions had become endless since Caroline died. Naomi was changing linens in the east guest room. Mrs. Keller continued. "She heard him before any of us reached the hallway. She did not run in like she owned the place. She stood at the door and asked me with her eyes if she could help. I told her the rule. No staff inside the therapy suite unless assigned." Her voice softened. Then Ethan made that sound. Richard swallowed. He knew that sound. A breath caught halfway between panic and pleading. "Naomi went in anyway," Mrs. Keller said. She stayed 6 feet from him. She lowered the lights. She moved the metal toy bin because it was rattling with the storm. She took chalk from the sensory drawer, placed it on the floor, and drew that door on paper. First, she waited until he looked at it. Then she wrote safe. Not for herself. For him. Ethan touched the yellow chalk to the tiny window he had drawn on the wall and filled it with light. Richard looked at the little yellow square on the wall and felt something inside him resist the truth with all the strength it had left. The room was telling him one story. His pride was telling him another. Ethan's breathing had slowed. His shoulders had loosened. The chalk in his hand moved with careful purpose, not chaos. And yet Richard's eyes kept returning to the marks on the wall, as if the damage to paint mattered more than the healing that had happened in front of it. Dr. Hayes stepped closer, lowering her voice into that polished tone people used when they wanted authority to sound like concern. "Mr. Whitmore, emotional incidents can appear meaningful in the moment, but structure is what protects him. If household staff begin improvising interventions, the treatment plan loses stability." Mrs. Keller's face tightened. The treatment plan was not here when he needed someone. The words were quiet, but they struck the room hard. Richard turned toward her slowly. For 17 years, she had never spoken to him that way. Not when Caroline was alive. Not after the funeral. Not even during the months when grief made him sharp with everyone who stayed. "Mrs. Keller," he said, "that is enough." Ethan's chalk stopped moving. The silence that followed was thin and immediate, like the air before glass cracks. Richard noticed it too late. He softened his voice and took one step toward his son. Ethan pulled the chalk close to his chest and turned his body away. It was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was small. Final. Richard froze. From somewhere downstairs came the faint sound of the staff entrance opening again, then hurried voices near the mudroom. Naomi had not left the property yet. She was being processed out like a misplaced delivery, waiting while a night supervisor collected her badge and recorded the early termination. Richard could have stopped it. He could have walked down the back stairs, met her beside the lockers, and asked one honest question. What did you see in my son that I could not? Instead, he reached for the safer answer, the colder answer, the answer that kept him in command. Have the wall cleaned before morning, he said. Mrs. Keller stared at him. Sir, I said before morning. His voice did not rise. That made it worse. Dr. Hayes nodded once, satisfied, and began typing a note into her tablet. The sound of her fingernails on the glass screen filled the room with tiny clicks. Ethan lowered his head. The yellow chalk slipped from his fingers and landed on the rug without a sound. Downstairs, Naomi stood beneath a buzzing fluorescent light while the supervisor counted the bills from her final envelope. He removed the last day of pay for property damage, explaining it with the embarrassed stiffness of a man repeating someone else's decision. Naomi looked at the envelope, then at the rain beyond the service door. She did not argue. She only asked whether Ethan had settled. The supervisor blinked, caught off guard by the question. That is not your concern anymore, he said. Naomi nodded slowly, but her eyes moved toward the ceiling, toward the boy above her, toward the room where a small door of yellow light was about to be wiped away. The rain had softened by the time Naomi stepped through the service door, but the cold found her anyway, slipping under the collar of her coat and into the tired spaces beneath her ribs. The Whitmore driveway curved nearly a quarter-mile through dark lawns and bare trees, every lamp along the path glowing gold against the wet stone. Behind her, the mansion looked untouched, all tall windows and pale walls, as if it had never held a crying child, a frightened father, or a woman folding her pride into a thin paper envelope. Naomi kept walking. Her shoes were not made for rain, and soon the hem of her uniform was damp against her knees. She held the envelope in one hand and her phone in the other, checking the time for the last train south. 11:42. If she missed it, she would be waiting under the station lights until after midnight. Still, halfway down the drive, she stopped and looked back. Not at Richard's office windows. Not at the front entrance, with its stone lions and polished brass. Her eyes lifted to the third floor, where Ethan's therapy suite faced the garden. One window glowed softer than the others. She imagined him sitting on the rug, silent again, while adults discussed him as if he were a problem to be managed. Naomi pressed her lips together, then turned away before the ache could become tears. Upstairs, Mrs. Keller stood beside the therapy wall with a bowl of warm water and a white cloth in her hand. She had dismissed the junior cleaner who came to help. Some things, she believed, should not be erased by strangers. Dr. Hayes had left 30 minutes earlier, promising to revise Ethan's plan by morning. Richard had gone to his study, though the light under his door kept flickering as he paced. Ethan sat on the rug near the chalk pieces, knees drawn close, gaze fixed on the yellow door and the word Naomi had written beside it. Mrs. Keller dipped the cloth into the water. Her hand trembled. I am sorry, sweetheart, she whispered, though she knew he would not answer. Your father gave instructions. Ethan reached out before the cloth touched the wall. Not fast, not loud, just one small hand placed between the water and the word safe. Mrs. Keller froze. The boy did not look at her. He looked at the chalk. Then he picked up the blue piece Naomi had used earlier and pressed it to the wall. Downstairs, Richard stood alone in his study, staring at a muted security monitor he had turned on without admitting why. On the screen, his son's small body leaned toward the white wall. The first letter appeared slowly. N. Richard's breath caught. The second letter came after a long pause. A. Mrs. Keller covered her mouth with one hand. Ethan's fingers shook, but he kept going. O.M.I. The name sat there in blue chalk, uneven and bright beneath the soft therapy lights. Naomi. Richard gripped the edge of his desk. For months, he had paid experts to pull one sound from his son, one word, one sign of wanting anything from the world. And now Ethan had given him a name. Not Dr. Hayes. Not Dad. Not the name Richard had forbidden himself to say. Naomi. On the monitor, Ethan placed his palm over the letters as if keeping them warm. Richard turned toward the window. Far down the drive, beyond the silver wash of rain, Naomi was almost at the gate. Richard moved before pride could stop him. The security monitor still glowed behind him, blue and white in the dark study, but his eyes were already on the rain-streaked window, on the small figure walking toward the iron gate at the end of the drive. For a moment, he did not look like a billionaire or a man who signed towers into existence with one hand. He looked like a father who had just realized he had mistaken silence for emptiness. He crossed the study, opened the door, and nearly collided with Mrs. Keller in the hall. Her face was pale, her cardigan damp at the cuffs from the bowl of water she had abandoned upstairs. "Sir," she said, breathless. He wrote her name. Richard nodded once, but no words came. From the therapy suite above them came a faint sound. Not a cry, not speech, something softer, the scrape of chalk against paint. They both turned. Richard climbed the stairs 2 at a time, then slowed at the top because fear had weight, and it settled on his shoulders before he entered the room. Ethan was still on the rug. The name Naomi remained bright in blue chalk, protected by the shape of his handprint. Beneath it, the boy had started another word. Richard stepped closer, carefully, as if the air itself might break. M. He watched the first letter appear. O. The second came slower. Ethan paused, breathing through his nose, concentrating so hard his eyebrows drew together. M. The finished word sat under Naomi's name like a question Richard had spent 2 years refusing to hear. Naomi. Mom. The room lost all sound. Mrs. Keller pressed her fingers to her lips. Richard stared at the wall, and something cold opened in his chest. "Ethan," he whispered. The boy did not look at him. Instead, he reached toward the low shelf beside the therapy lamp, pulled open a narrow drawer, and took out a folded piece of paper Richard had never seen before. Its edges were worn soft from being handled in secret. Ethan held it out, not to Richard at first, but toward the empty doorway, as if expecting Naomi to be there. Richard knelt, slowly, and accepted it. The paper unfolded with a dry whisper. It was a photograph. Caroline stood in sunlight outside a community center on the south side, wearing jeans, a white sweater, and the patient smile Richard had loved before grief turned memory into something painful. Beside her stood a younger Naomi Brooks, maybe 22, holding a stack of children's books against her chest. On the back, written in Caroline's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Naomi has a gift. She listens where others correct." Richard read the sentence once. Then again, his vision blurred at the edges. Caroline had volunteered for years with children who struggled to speak, children whose language lived in pictures, gestures, routines, and trust. He remembered her talking about a brilliant young woman from one of her workshops, a student who could calm a room just by lowering her voice. He had not listened closely then. There had always been another deal, another call, another flight waiting. Now the past was standing on his son's wall in blue chalk. Naomi was not a stranger who had crossed a line. She was the person Caroline had once believed in. Ethan touched the photograph, then touched Naomi's name, then pointed toward the window where the driveway disappeared into rain. Richard understood. Not perfectly, not as a man in control, as a father finally being taught by his child. He rose, took the photograph in one hand and the blue chalk in the other, then turned to Mrs. Keller. "Do not clean that wall," he said, his voice uneven. "Not tonight. Not ever." Then he ran toward the stairs, leaving the white room behind him, because the gate was closing and Naomi Brooks was still walking away. The iron gate had almost finished sliding closed when Richard reached the end of the drive, his dress shoes splashing through shallow water, his breath visible in the cold night air. Naomi was already on the far side, walking toward the county road with her coat pulled tight and her shoulders straight in that quiet way people stand when they refuse to let humiliation bend them. The guard looked startled when Richard stepped past him without waiting for an umbrella. "Naomi," Richard called. But the rain softened his voice and carried it sideways into the trees. She kept walking, not because she had not heard him, but because women like Naomi learned early that powerful men often called after people only when they wanted something fixed. Richard stopped under the gate light, the photograph in one hand, the blue chalk in the other. "Miss Brooks," he said again, louder this time. That made her pause. Slowly, she turned. The road behind her was dark except for the distant sweep of headlights passing beyond the hill, and for the first time that night Richard saw the full distance between his world and hers. Not just the gate, not just the stone driveway or the 12,000 square feet behind him. The distance was in the way she held her final envelope like proof she had been dismissed, in the damp hem of her uniform, in the tired patience of her eyes. He walked toward her, slower now, careful not to make his urgency feel like another order. "My son wrote your name," he said. Naomi's face changed before she could stop it. Something opened, then closed again. "Is he all right?" Richard looked down, ashamed by how quickly she asked about Ethan and not herself. "He is calm," he said. "He wrote your name on the wall. Then he wrote Mom underneath it." Naomi inhaled softly, and the sound seemed to take the cold with it. Richard held out the photograph. She did not take it at first. She only looked. Caroline's smile glowed faintly under the gate lamp, younger, alive, forever caught in sunlight outside the community center. Naomi's hand rose toward the picture, then stopped halfway. "She kept that." "Ethan did," Richard said. "I think Caroline gave it to him, or maybe he found it after she was gone. I do not know. There is a lot I do not know." The admission sat between them, heavier than the rain. Naomi finally took the photograph with both hands. Her thumb moved over Caroline's face with a tenderness Richard had no right to interrupt. "She taught me that silence was not absence," Naomi said. "She said children speak in whatever language feels safe enough to survive." Richard swallowed. He had heard Caroline say things like that at dinner, in the car, while folding Ethan's little shirts on Sunday nights. He had nodded without listening. Now her lesson had returned through a woman he had sent out into the rain. "I was wrong," he said. Naomi looked up. "Yes, you were. No softness. No cruelty. Just truth." Richard nodded. "I saw a uniform before I saw your judgment. I saw someone I thought I could dismiss before I saw the person my wife trusted. I spoke to you as if this house made me higher than you. It did not. It only made me harder to reach." Naomi's eyes shone, but she did not look away. "Your son does not need another person hired to manage him. I know. He does not need a perfect room. I know that now. And he does not need me brought back because you are afraid." Richard stood still. Behind him, the mansion lights trembled in the rain like candles behind glass. "Then tell me what he needs," he said. Naomi looked toward the third-floor window. "He needs his father to sit on the floor even when there is nothing to fix. He needs his mother's name allowed back into the house. He needs people to stop treating his silence like a locked door and start treating it like a room they have been invited to enter gently." Richard closed his fingers around the chalk. "Will you come back and help me learn how?" Naomi did not answer right away. A car passed on the road, sending a thin spray of water along the curb. At last, she handed him the photograph but kept her final envelope in her pocket. "First," she said, "you apologized to Ethan. Not for the wall. For not seeing him. Then you apologized to Mrs. Keller and every staff member who watched you send me out like I did not matter." Richard nodded once, slowly, the way a man does when the cost is finally fair. "And after that?" he asked. Naomi turned toward the gate, where the warm driveway lights waited beyond the rain. "After that," she said, "we ask Ethan what he wants to draw next." By the time Naomi and Richard returned to the therapy suite, the house had changed without moving. The same marble floors shone under the same soft lights. The same rain whispered against the tall windows, yet every hallway felt as if it were holding its breath. Mrs. Keller stood near the door with Ethan beside her, his small hand still stained blue from the chalk. Richard stopped at the threshold. For once, he did not enter like the room belonged to him. He looked at his son first, then lowered himself slowly onto the rug, not caring that his suit pants touched the chalk dust and the damp mark left by the bowl of water. Ethan watched him with cautious eyes. Richard placed Caroline's photograph on the floor between them and set the blue chalk beside it. His voice came out rough, but quiet. "I am sorry, Ethan. I thought I was protecting you by controlling everything around you. I was wrong. I should have listened to your silence instead of trying to make it disappear." Ethan did not speak. He did not need to. His fingers moved toward the photograph, then toward the wall, then back to his father's hand. Richard held still, afraid to ruin the moment by needing too much from it. A tear slipped down his face and landed on the rug without sound. Then he turned to Mrs. Keller. "I am sorry for speaking over you. You saw what I refused to see." Mrs. Keller nodded once, her eyes wet, her dignity intact. Richard looked at Naomi last. The room grew even quieter. "And I am sorry for the way I treated you. Not only for firing you. For assuming your uniform told me your worth." Naomi stood beneath the warm therapy light, rain still caught in the ends of her hair, her final envelope folded in her pocket. She did not rush to forgive him. Forgiveness, she knew, was not a performance for wealthy guilt. It was a door that opened only when truth had stood outside long enough. At last, she stepped toward Ethan and sat on the floor, leaving space between them the way she always did. "What do you want to draw next?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at the wall. Naomi's name was still there. Mom was still beneath it. The yellow door glowed beside the word safe. Slowly, Ethan picked up the chalk and added one more shape. Not a tower, not a perfect house, a small circle of 3 figures sitting on the floor together. Weeks passed, and Richard kept his promise. Caroline's photographs returned to the lower floors, one at a time. Dr. Hayes was replaced by a team that began by observing instead of correcting. Naomi was invited back, not through the service entrance, but through the front door, with a contract that named her as Ethan's communication aide and paid her enough to return to school part-time. The white wall was never cleaned. It became Ethan's language, changing day by day with suns, storms, doors, hands, names, and colors that no longer frightened anyone. One late afternoon, as lake wind moved gently through an open window, Richard sat on the rug beside his son while Naomi arranged books on a low shelf. Ethan lifted a piece of green chalk and wrote 2 careful words beneath the old blue name. "Dad, stay." Richard read them, then covered his mouth with one trembling hand. Naomi looked away, giving father and son the privacy of their own miracle. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Light moved across the room, touched the wall, and rested there, quiet and gold.